Now your goal is just to kill them while you die.
What's up, everybody? It's Hunter, and I got Zayden here. I assume, yep, he can be seen in the screen a little bit. That is my son. He's decided to play Wild Rift. Wow.
Types of foliage here. And I'll just talk about these three types briefly. So the bottom two, landscape grass.
I'll show you what I've done while I've been away from the stream. He had me set up this like octagon thing. He keeps calling it the garden. I assume it's where we're gonna set up our foliage for each zone. First, we're gonna be working in this zone or this zone over here. And these octagons are supposed to have
type static mesh foliage. Those are exactly what I mentioned. They're instant static meshes. So the performance of that is very good. The top one called actor foliage. So that one's unique because that's going to actually, when it paints, treat every individual entity as an individual entity. So then you can modify individual actors in the world. So there's no performance improvement to doing that. Yeah, it says the cost of painting this foliage is the same as adding actors in the scene. The only benefit there is that you could put a ton of those actors in the scene very quickly. So instead of having to drag and drag and drag and drag, it's just paint and you got them all in there. But the actual painting works exactly the same to what we're going to do today. But today we're going to be focused on static mesh foliage here. So I'll go ahead and select that for our first one. And I'm going to rename this Earth Rock 1. And then I can double click to go into it. When you go into it, you're brought to the foliage editor with a lot of different foliage settings, and we'll go through these. So the first thing is, let's select our mesh. So if you search for Nordic, I'm just going to choose this Nordic Beach Boulder, the very first one. And let's just go through some of the key settings here. Not all of them, but the stuff that's important. So the Z offset, so let me minimize this just to show you what I'm referring to with this. So if you take a look at this asset, right, so if we place it right on the edge of the ground on the right-hand side, it could still be above the ground on the left-hand side. Some of these assets, we really want to make sure that they're not just resting on top of the ground, but we really want to embed them in the ground. And in general, for these big rocks, these boulders, I think it's a safe practice to do that. So that's really what that Z offset is. It's like, how much do we want to embed that asset into the ground? So in general, for these rocks, I'm going to set a minimum of about -40 and a maximum.
So, the Z offset. So, he's saying basically when you have, let's go choose one of my actors, you could have a situation where you have one of these, and while one side is on the ground, the other side is in the air. Let's see, can I find one? This one looks like it's doing it right now, actually. So you might notice, and it's very, very slight. Oh, actually, this side's really obvious. You might have this side coming up in a way you don't like. Like, let's say you have this one trying to be flush with the ground, right? You might have some stuff that you don't want hanging off the ground, and apparently, if we set the Z offset,
angle and the random pitch angle. So the question is, how much do we want to allow that rock to vary compared to the angle of the landscape? So if the landscape's like this, we always want to align that rock perfectly up against the landscape, or do we want to allow it to be a little bit tilted off center? And in general, I tend to give this about a 3-degree allowance for both of these settings. For the random yaw, typically we want to keep that checked because that's what allows the rock to be rotated around the Z axis. So it allows it to be facing in any direction. The ground slope angle. This isn't important yet, but for our foliage, especially when we paint the outer edges of our quadrant with a specific foliage type, that's going to be important. So this is the maximum angle that we will want to allow painting of our foliage to take place on. So for example, let's say we have a cliff face and it's like almost vertical. You wouldn't want to place a rock on the side of that cliff because realistically gravity would pull it down. But in this case, it's set to 45 degrees, which is about this kind of angle. And I think that's okay for now, but for our edges of the rivers, that's going to have a pretty steep angle. So we need to make sure to change that when we get to that foliage type. Mobility is going to be static. Casting shadow, all of that's good. I think the only other setting we really need to change here is the collision. Let's make sure to set that to block all because we want our player, our character, to be able to jump and run on those rocks. So I'll set that to block all. But keep in mind, you still need to set that in each individual static mesh. And then I'll save that. And so now let's actually test painting that on the landscape. And for the last couple of episodes, we've been either select or landscape. And so we're just moving down the list. So now we're going on to foliage mode. If you select that, And instantly when you do that, you might see a whole bunch of foliage assets here if you've already downloaded the assets for our water quadrant. And that's because whenever you download plant foliage, it automatically comes with a foliage asset already. It's just the rocks for which we have to create these manually. But what I want you to do is just clear all these out. So select the top left one, come down, come down, come down all the way to the bottom right, and just delete to clear them out. Going to have a completely blank palette from which we can paint. But now if you come back to your content drawer, select your earth rock, drag it in there, and we'll select that. And once you check it, you'll be...
Hold on, our earth rock.
But now if you come back to your content drawer, select your earth rock, drag it in there, and we'll select that angle. So the meshes, which is just a real rendering individual entity. So then you can modify individual drag, it's just paint and you got them all in there. But the actual painting works exactly the same to what we're going to do today. But today we're going to be focused on static mesh foliage here. So I'll go ahead and select that for our first one. And I'm going to rename this Earth Rock 1. And then I can double click to go into it. And when you go into it, you're brought to the foliage editor with a lot of different foliage settings. And we'll go through these. So the first thing is, let's select our mesh. So if you search for Nordic, I'm just going to choose this Nordic Beach Boulder, the very first one. And let's just go through some of the key settings here. Not all of them, but the stuff that's important. So the Z offset, so let me minimize this just to show you what I'm referring to with this. So if you take a look at this asset, right, so if we place it right on the edge of the ground on the right-hand side, it could still be above the ground on the left-hand side. Some of these assets, we really want to make sure that they're not just resting on top of the ground, but we really want to embed them in the ground. And in general, for these big rocks, these boulders, I think it's a safe practice to do that. So that's really what that Z offset is. It's like, how much do we want to embed that asset in? But now if you come back to your content drawer, select your earth rock, drag it in there, and we'll select that. And once you check it, you'll be able to actually paint. But before we paint, let me go over just a few settings here. So the first ones are our brush options. We have our brush size, we have our paint density. These are very similar to what we used in our landscape editor in the sculpting tool. And then we have the filters here. And this is particularly important because really the question is, what are we painting this asset on? So in our case, we're specifically painting it on landscape. But for example, in Unreal Engine Early Access, they released a world with no landscape and it was just static meshes on static meshes. So if you wanted to paint rocks or anything on those static meshes, then you would need to check the static meshes here. But this is a nice easy way to prevent overlap. Like if you don't want rocks to be painted on top of each other, you would just unselect static meshes there. So I'm going to make sure our filters are just set to landscape here. And then down here in the bottom left-hand corner, so we have our paint density. So this is basically the amount of rocks, the amount of our foliage asset that's in a 1,000 by 1,000 unit area, which is roughly 10 meters by 10 meters. So it's roughly the size of my brush here because that's set to 1,000 as well. So if I go like this, click, I've got roughly 100 rocks there. Now we've got 158, so it's a little bit more. Now the radius, I don't typically use this, but this specifies the minimum distance between each individual asset. The reason I don't typically use it is because the density setting usually takes care of that. It's only if I deliberately want to space things out a certain distance away from each other that I would use that. Scaling, this is important. So typically I set this to uniform. If I have only a few assets in a particular area and I want to give the illusion of having many different assets, so let's say I only had like 3 types of rocks, but I want to make them all look different. So in that case, I might set it to free. And that way, each of the axes, like the X and the Y and the X and the Y and the Z axis could all vary independently. Kind of gives the illusion that you have more assets in the scene than you actually do because they're each sized differently, but sometimes it makes the assets look kind of weird. So typically I set this, especially if I have a lot of assets like I do for the rocks here, I set it to uniform, but I do vary the total scale. So some rocks are smaller, some are larger, so it still gives it some variation. So for example, we might do something like 0.8 to 1.5, and then if I paint, you'll see some that are like pretty small and some that are a lot larger. And because we have the align to normal checked, those are all aligned into our landscape. And because we have our random yaw checked, then those are all kind of rotated at a different angle. So the erase density is related to the paint density. So what I mean by that is if I set the erase density to 0.25, and I got to make sure to select erase, because this is half what the paint density is, it's going to remove roughly half these rocks if I erase now. And I could set it to an even lower level, like 0.1, and it'll erase even more. could set it to a lower level and it'll erase even more, and you can kind of play with this to get a sense of, well, how many assets do you actually want in the scene. So you can always paint too many and then use the erase feature to kind of cull back. And if you set that to 0, then erasing will get rid of everything. All right, so now I'm going to go back to select mode. I'm going to
take a minute on the stream. There's a lot going on, so give me just a minute here. I'll be right back. Actually, here, let me just get rid of my audio.
Go into the content drawer, and we're just going to duplicate our foliage asset 12 times here. I guess 11 times, so that we have 12 rock foliage assets. And the fastest way I found to do this is just right-click, duplicate, and just keep on going down the list. And then once you've duplicated the 12, you can go into the second one, and we could just switch it to our next. Save, we'll keep going right on down. And to make this go faster, what you could do is you could right-click on the folder, say show a new content browser. That'll speed this up a bit. And luckily, we're not going to have to do this for the actual plant foliage, because those assets that we download from Megascans, they automatically come with foliage assets here. But just for our rocks, we have to do this. Now, when you hit Earth Rock 7 here, you're going to need to change out your mesh a little bit. So if you search for Tundra, is it Tundra? Pretty sure it's Tundra. All right, so now that we got our 12 foliage assets, I'm going to go back into foliage mode, go to our content drawer, and I can click, drag, bring them all in. And now I can select all of these. But remember, before I actually paint these, let's look at our meshes over here. So not all of them are the same size, right? So some of these I want to scale down a little bit, and others I want to scale up. And luckily, all these are of nanite quality, so even if we make them a little bit bigger, they're still going to appear pretty high fidelity. So these three right here, if I select those three, I'm going to just set those. So those are kind of those three right there. I'm going to set them just 0.8 to 1.2. I think they're a good size, generally speaking. Our little one here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So it's going to be 1.3 to 1.8. And then this one's our massive one, Earth Rock 2. That's going to be 0.5 to 0.2. All right, so now we're just about ready to start painting. But before we start painting, I want to talk about performance a little bit, and I want to talk about the most important performance metric in our game, and that's the benchmark called frames per second, or FPS. Usually games, what they're really struggling to do as they're developing a game is hit a certain FPS benchmark. So they'll say we have to have 45 frames per second or 45 FPS. And the reason is that if FPS drops below a certain threshold, then the player...
Quick break. Let's check the polls, huh? Where we at? Okay. So you got North Carolina, got Virginia. Ooh, Wisconsin's 1% reporting red. 1%. Those don't matter. Texas is looking good for Donald Trump. New Mexico's 2%, doesn't matter. All these look good. Georgia's looking good. South Carolina, yeah, Georgia's close though. North Carolina, super close. Virginia with 51% reporting. Donald Trump won Florida, 94%. That's where I live. Go Donald Trump. It's not very close either. That's what, a 14-point victory? Is that how that's how they do that? Let me see. I just want to make sure I'm right. Yeah, if it were to come in the way it is, that's a 14 point victory. That's what we like to see down here in Florida. We love us some Donald Trump. All right, back to the coding. This is my baby, by the way. This is my Quinemaeus. You saw Zayden. Man, you know, this is dad life. It's a great life. I'll tell you what, the only thing I love better than trying to make beautiful video games, which I am trying very hard to figure out, is being dad. It's my favorite part of my life. It's the thing I'm doing the best at so far. This kid is beautiful and amazing. And then Zayden, who you saw, oh my gosh, he's mad at me. All right, little man, come here. He was taking a nap, and his mom is very upset that he's no longer napping. All right, I'll be back. I'm going to pause the stream for a minute. I'll be right back.
Zay had to go in there and wake him up.
I know.
And now he's pissed at me for being
So, yeah. All right. Anyways, he's adorable. Zayden is like a super genius. He's only 7, but he looks like he's 9. He acts like he's 13. You know, it's great and it's hard. It's hard to have a kid that's that smart.
Actually visibly recognizes when the game stalls or when it suffers a little bit. I've seen really good games where sometimes that happens. So for example, I remember the original StarCraft, and I'm really dating myself here, but the original StarCraft, you had these giant carriers where you had like hundreds of these little fighters flying around, and at times, even though I had a decent PC at the time, the fighters would go and you knew immediately that that was a performance issue. In most games, they at least try to target 30 FPS, but usually if there's a lot of fast action, they try to get at least 45 or 60. And so really that's what we're trying to do here. We're going to try to keep above 60 whenever possible, but really 45 is our bare minimum. And the reason we're covering this now is because for the first time, we're doing something in our level that's going to seriously impact our frames per second. So let me first show you how you can track your frames per second, and we'll go from there. So if you come up to the top left corner of your viewport and select Show FPS, and you'll see that right in the top right. And right now I'm at 120 because there's really not much going on in the game. But as we begin painting stuff, especially our plant foliage, which doesn't use nanite, you're really going to start to see that FPS begin to drop. All right, so now we're ready to paint. So make sure you're in paint mode, make sure you've got all your assets selected, all of them checked off, all of your settings look good. And brush size, we'll keep that to about 1,000. But the paint density, so that's going to be important because 0.5 here, it's going to be crazy dense. I'll just show you that. So if I start painting and you see it actually kind of freeze up for a moment there, it takes a little while to load the shaders. Yeah, it's just crazy, crazy dense. So I can actually decrease that considerably. Let's go down to 0.00, let's try 2. No, let's try even less. Let's try 0.01 and see what that looks like. Yeah, so that's pretty good, right? Might want it a little bit more dense than that, but that's already looking pretty decent. So I'm just going to do Control Z. And usually when I'm painting, that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'll tweak one setting, paint a little bit, Control Z, change a different setting, paint a little bit, Control Z, and we just go from there until I get the settings looking exactly right. All right, so here we go.
Okay, so he's going for
And now I can increase my brush size and paint the interior. And for this, I actually have to increase the paint density a proportionate amount. So I'll increase it to 0.06 to match that increase in brush size. And so now let me go back to select mode and let's actually play and see what this looks like. And take a look at my FPS there. So yeah, so now we're looking at about 95 to 100. Yeah, it's still a decent FPS, but yeah.
Let's see how this works. I don't know. We'll see how it works, right? I'm not an expert at this. So I want to try to... I mean, I want my brush size to be a lot less. Did he change?
And that's really because we're looking at the interior. And for this, I actually have to increase the paint density a proportionate amount. So I'll increase it to 0.06 to match that increase in brush size. And so now let me go back. Brush size, we'll keep that to about 1,000. But the paint...
All right, let's see if I can do that. It feels like a lot of brush size here. Let's see. Alright, and then we'll go down this way. And then we'll come out this way. I see. So there's something good about this where it won't let me paint on my slopes, which is really great since I don't want to paint on my slopes. And also, I think this is fine. It doesn't have to be as dense as what he does. Yeah. Kind of neat, right? Okay. So yeah, that's going to be... Maybe I will turn it up to 0.06 and try and go over some of these areas here. Anyway, okay, like right around there. Huh, that is kind of neat.
Density, so that's going to be important because 0.5 here, it's going to be crazy dense. I'll just show you that. So if I start painting and you see it actually kind of freeze up for a moment there, takes a little while to load the shaders. Yeah, it's just crazy dense. So I can actually decrease that considerably. Let's go down to 0.00, let's try 2. No, let's try even less. Let's try 0.01 and see what that looks like. Yeah, so that's pretty good, right? Might want it a little bit more dense than that, but that's already looking pretty decent. So I'm just going to do Control Z. And usually when I'm painting, that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'll tweak one setting, paint a little bit, Control Z, change a different setting, paint a little bit, Control Z, and we just go from there until I get the settings looking exactly right. All right, so here we go. And now I can increase my brush size and paint the interior. And for this, I actually have to increase the paint density a proportionate amount. So I'll increase it to 0.6, but yeah. And that's really because we're looking at completely static assets here. And that's the benefit of those instant hierarchical static meshes. So this is looking pretty good. It's looking a little bit too dense. And also I do think that these really big rocks are still a little bit too big in proportion to the others. So I'm going to try to increase the size of some of the other rocks and I'm going to decrease the boulder. Change.
It's very interesting. I'm going to be honest. When I started this project, my goal was not to go into all this landscaping stuff and you know, so this is a little bit not what I was expecting, but it's fine. Like, I'm learning a lot here, and that's probably good. I definitely think, at least on the virtual texture stuff, I would still have to watch videos again if I was to do it again. But this foliage stuff, like, I do think I understand how to create, and I think it's easy to remember and probably good to remember if you're looking at creating foliage, because I remember the first time I went to start creating foliage, and I watched a video and I didn't bother remembering. But you
are kind of a generalized shape and structure. I can't really tell whether one is bigger than
whichever one. So static mesh foliage is awesome for
another. Some do look repeating, but there's enough variation across the landscape. The only problem here is I would say it's a little too dense, right? So let's thin it out a bit. See the numbers of our assets below decrease. So right now it's about 600 to 700. So let's try. So you see me just kind of playing with these settings until I get it to a good level. start really taking a look at it. So the next thing we're going to do is begin painting our Nordic coastal ground cover. So if you go to our Mega Scans folder and then 3D plants under the Earth quadrant and main palette, I found this really great set of ground cover for what I think this Earth quadrant should look like. So if you go in the Nordic coastal ground cover folder, you have all these different static meshes for the foliage, but you can go directly to our foliage folder that it already comes with. And then from here, you can select the top one, come down, select the bottom one. And if you go into our foliage mode, we can then drag those all in, same way we did for our rocks. And so now I'm going to unselect each of the rocks. So I can select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one.
Okay, so this will be the last.
You have all these different static meshes for the foliage, but you can go directly to our foliage folder that it already comes with. And then from here, you can select the top one, come down, select the bottom one. And if you go into our foliage mode, we can then drag those all in, same way we did for our rocks. And so now,
Hold on.
but you can go directly to our foliage folder that it already comes with. And then from here, you can select the top one, come down, select the bottom one. And if you go into our foliage mode, we can then drag those all in, same way we did for our rocks. And so now I'm going to unselect each of the rocks. So I can select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one, uncheck, and we're going to select all of our foliage here, check those off. And I just want to go over a few unique settings for our foliage here. So we're going to skip down to scaling here, uniform. Let's make this maybe like 0.9 to 1.1. So because there are so many assets in this foliage pack, I don't think we need to vary them all that much, and they look pretty good as is. But also, if you come down under placement and under advanced, there's a really, we can then drag those all in, same way we did for our rocks. And so now I'm going to unselect each of the rocks. So I can select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one, uncheck, and we're going to select all of our foliage here, check those off. And I just want to go over a few unique settings for our foliage here. So we're going to skip down to scaling here, uniform. Let's make this maybe like 0.9 to 1.1. So because there are so many assets.
Scaling, where's that scaling? Uniform. 0.9 to 1.1. So he's really trying to make these things pretty similar. He's giving a lot of credit to the assets
In this foliage pack, I don't think we need to vary them all that much, and they look pretty good as is. But also, if you come down under placement and under advanced, there's a really important setting here for plant foliage, this collision with world. And the reason that that's so important, especially if we have static meshes like these rocks here, is that unless we select this collision with world, it's not going to check whether or not there's a rock whenever we place that foliage. So even if we have landscape checked here, we don't want to have the foliage paint over a place where a rock is already there. I mean, I suppose sometimes foliage could grow right out of a rock, but in general, that's not something we want to have happen. So make sure that that's checked, collision with world, but specifically do that for plant-based foliage. So now, because there are so many assets in this pack, we can keep our paint density pretty low here. I can navigate over to paint, and then let's...
Hold on, let's put that paint density way down. 0.005, right? That's what he does. And then 1,000 and... raise density, we don't really care about that, but we'll put it to 0.
Let's give it a go. And right away, we see our numbers start to increase there. And because our numbers are still pretty low here, I'm going to up our density. I'm going to up it to something like 0.002. And now we see those numbers start to increase. And I'm also going to watch my frame rate in the top right.
I'm not seeing anything.
I'm going to increase my brush size to about 3,000. And we see our frame rate really start to drop there. It's not dropping because of the foliage per se, but it is dropping because we're trying to paint a large area, and it's having to do a collision check with all those rocks every time it paints. Because if there's a rock there, we don't want foliage sticking out of the ground. All right, so now our numbers are in the 300s, and let's hit play, and let's see what that's starting to look like. And that's looking pretty good, right? Pretty high density.
It's not doing anything on mine. I'm not sure why. Paint. Let's turn this paint density to like 0.2. Does that do anything? No, it's not doing anything. Something's wrong.
per se, but it is dropping because we're trying to paint a large area and it's having to do a collision check with all those rocks every time it paints. Because if there's a rock there, we don't want foliage sticking out of it.
That'll be something I'll figure out later, and I'll let you guys know how that goes. All right. Have a good night.